edits the Oxford Analytica Daily Brief, which is read by G20 governments, European international organizations, and many of the world's largest markets, actually. So, Dr. Redman, we are about to hear your presentation, and afterwards, depending on our time left, we are having the opportunity for the audience to ask you several questions. So, please, the stage is yours.
Vicky, thank you very much. Thanks, everyone, for coming here. I know you have so many choices about what to do. Just in advertising terms, I'm going to talk about the world in 2030 rather than the world in 2023. It would have been an odd title for a session on the future. A lot can change in 7 years. Consider what happened since April 2016. Brexit, I say that not because I'm a Brit, because it was the first thing that happened. Trump, and then his impact in government and on governance in the United States. A trade war between the United States and China that would have seemed inconceivable a few years earlier. A pandemic, of course. The invasion of Ukraine and the adoption of a number of net zero targets in major governments around the world. So we have to be open to the idea of a lot changing in the next 7 years. And the much larger number of things within that will be happening. Changing is what we're focused on. So looking at it, it becomes quite difficult. Some things I think are meant to change, some things I feel like are baked in, some things we're certain but we don't know how much of an impact we have, and then there are other things we're not sure if they're going to happen, but if they do happen they certainly will have an impact. So let's start with the first of those. What is baked in? What is the things that we can rely on? It's unsurprisingly demography. So because we know what the demographic situation in the world is today, because every woman who will be giving birth in 2030 is already alive today, we know pretty much what demography is going to be. Today we have 8 billion people in the world. We will be moving that number up very slowly, about 1% growth a year, with fertility and mortality both having gone down. China's population is going to decline from here on quite dramatically, whereas India, together with Pakistan, the Philippines, Egypt, Ethiopia, Nigeria and Tanzania, those 8 countries on their own are going to provide half of the world's population growth to 2030 and beyond. It's going to be a challenge for all 8, because when population growth is good for GDP, when population growth is very rapid, it's very difficult to cut the poverty rate. And that's a challenge that all those countries are going to face. In Europe, population in Bulgaria, Latvia, Lithuania and Serbia is going to drop quite fast. Up until now, natural increase in the populations, that's births over deaths, has been a greater driver of population growth in Europe than migration. But by 2030, it's only going to be down to migration whether the European population grows or not. The more interesting aspect is actually in our changing demographic profile. So today there are 770 million people in the world who are aged over 65. By 2030, it's just going to be short of 1 billion. It'll be 994 million. In Europe, we're at the end, as we know, of the post-war demographic dividend. Between 2022 and 2030, the number of Europeans aged 0 to 19 will fall from 88 million to 82 million. The number of people aged 20 to 64, so that's the tax base, that's your working age population, will fall from 256 million to 245 million. But the number of people aged 65 plus are going to rise from 92 million to 105 million. So let's put that into some sort of detail. To be clear, this means losing 11 million people from the working population and from your tax base, and adding 13 million more people who are on pensioners that they are going to have to support. So this is going to put additional strain on government budgets at a time when they're also supposed to be boosting defence, boosting resilience and decarbonising the economy. It will increase pressure for retirement age to be risen in many countries. Governments should probably then be putting more investment into skilling their population throughout their working lives, accepting that those working lives are going to be extended, and that, as we've been hearing in the previous session, technology is going to change the context quite a lot. Whether they will all be able to afford it, I'm doubtful. Let's look at the economy. How are we doing for time? Very good. Very low interest rates and low inflation have been a norm for us all for the past few years until the pandemic and the post-pandemic recovery. Major central banks now are trying to move away from this experiment with ultra-low interest rates and quantitative easing. because they knew that it didn't work. It didn't sustainably get them to 2% inflation. The exit from this is going to be quite complicated. They wish to get it to a situation where inflation is around 2% and therefore nominal interest rates are around about 4%, 5%. So the next few years for us are going to be ones of high inflation and higher interest rates. But if you look at hundreds of years of data on interest rates, it shows that imperceptibly they nearly always go down. Of course, there are variations in the norm. If you have a war, if you have a pandemic, that will change. But the long-term trend is fairly clear. So by 2030, if those trends prevail, we're going to be back to an environment of low inflation, low interest rates, and most probably low GDP growth. Now, given all the demands on governments, I therefore suspect it might be quite difficult to row back on quantitative easing as the European Central Bank and the US Federal Reserve are expecting. Now on to some of the less certain things. If those are the two things that are sort of the environment that we can more or less rely on, what about others? Global emissions. I think they're still rising year on year. The expectation is that within the next few years, emissions will peak and they will fall. But the pace of greening will be uneven. And for that reason, I think it's reasonable to assume that the 1.5 degree target is likely to be missed. The pace of greening will be uneven. Progress has been made already in the power sector, but it's much easier to overhaul 50 power stations in a country when the technology already exists than it is to replace gas in industry where there are no, in some cases there are no replacements already available, or to persuade millions of European citizens to switch their cars to an electric vehicle. To say nothing of the tremendous changes that you need in the plumbing of the electricity grid and the capacity of the electricity grid in order to supply all our existing electricity and the extra that's going to be needed for a massive battery fleet. Voters are also going to have plenty to say about the transition, and if you look what happened in elections in the Netherlands about 6 weeks ago, you'll see that very, very clearly. Happy to take a question on that if you have time. Second thing that we know is going to happen, we don't know how far it's going to go, is the extent to which globalization will be reversed. Tech separation between the United States and China is already in hand. It's going to go quite deep. The United States has similarly set a course for a separation in green technology as well as in computing. The United States indeed is determined to cut China entirely out of the green supply transition chain. We also have, of course, Russia under sanctions, so already we're seeing changes in energy and grain markets that are likely only to extend the longer those sanctions go on. With the WTO still hamstrung, the penalties for breaking rules of the existing trade system are less than what they were. And in finance too, there's a question about whether more trade is going to be done in renminbi, whether some commodities might actually be priced and might be transacted in the Chinese currency, and whether in the wake of major sanctions against Russia, whether Russia and China and other economies will decide that the smartest thing is to start building workarounds to SWIFT and other parts of the global financial architecture. How big a change will AI have on things? Well, it's likely to eat quite a lot of jobs, maybe more at the low end, and also further up. It will help to find energy and other resource efficiencies, automate production, and services like customer support. Given the increase in healthcare bills, AI will certainly be quite useful for first-line delivery of service through chatbots, and at the advanced level it could potentially improve disease diagnosis, drug discovery, and surgical precision. I don't want to be the first one that understands surgical precision on the patient's table. Generative AI like ChatGPT and GPT-4 can definitely help any profession to create basic text, so it's more of a back office job. I think the interesting variable in this is how governments respond. So the more jobs that are killed, the more likelihood it is that governments will intervene. Technology is advancing much faster than government policymakers can possibly keep pace with. That makes smart regulation in good time almost impossible. What it doesn't prevent is outright blanket bans. And there might be reasons aside from job fears. So, for instance, AI models definitely create new cybersecurity risks by bringing more data online, where it can be stolen, where it can be corrupted, where it can be harnessed by hostile actors. Generative AI, as we've already seen, can also produce inaccurate, misleading and harmful content. And as we know, the regulatory environment now for a lot of this technology is much less permissive than it was. One personal potential is personal AI. So social scientists 5-10 years ago were actually talking about the opioid crisis in the United States before it hit the policy agenda. The next crisis that the social scientists are talking about is the epidemic of loneliness, particularly in the United States, but also in other societies. Personal AI is potentially the answer to that. You have a personal AI that is almost your friend, your PA, helps you out. Think about that. Yes, it's fairly terrifying. Now, the two big variables. I've talked about things that are...
we have 1 minute left, so we have the chance to exchange questions and answers.
Okay.
I don't want to make you anxious, but... No, please don't.
That's okay. Look, the big question really is the geopolitical one. It's binary. Is there going to be a conflict involving Taiwan before 2030 or not? The risks increase the closer we go towards 2030. China has time on its side, doesn't want to get into a conflict too soon, wishes to build up those military capacities, see if others can be weakened, whether other opportunities exist. But if we do have that conflict, by then it's going to change the world significantly. It's going to be massive disruption. The shocks coming out of that, particularly if the wide sanctions, would be huge. Let me add just another one. We'll just go a minute over if that's okay. Because there's another event before that which is equally important, potentially germane, and that is the 2024 US presidential election. If Donald Trump is a Republican candidate, which on balance right now looks more likely than not, and then if he were to win, then two big questions come up. The first is whether the United States, are you familiar with the hokey cokey, in, out, so is the United States going to leave the Paris Climate Agreement again under Trump? And the other would be, is the United States going to cut back support for Ukraine, which is something that Trump has signaled very clearly. Why does this matter? Well, firstly, if the United States was sharply to curtail assistance to Ukraine, financial, keeping the Ukrainian budget going, but also military aid, it would put the Europeans into a dreadfully difficult position. Can they sustain this war? Is it worth the trouble? It would be a massive blow to Ukraine's morale. It would be a huge fillip to Putin's morale. But it also creates a problem, because then if you have a contingency involving Taiwan at the end of the decade, for the Europeans, they would be in a very, very difficult position. They've been let down by the United States already in Afghanistan. If they were let down again over Ukraine, what are they going to do when their chief protector, which is what the United States still is and still will be, because not everyone in NATO is going to go to 2%. What do they do if their chief protector says, we need you completely on board with us on sanctioning China and standing up to China over Taiwan? Thank you.
Okay, so Mr. Redman, I don't know, is anybody willing to ask a question, or would you prefer me to ask some questions? What do you think? We had decided with Dr. Redman to be innovative and give you the chance to ask something, but if you don't want to, I could make some questions. So I would like you to tell us, are there any trends from some populations in order to see the post-2030 future? Because I'm feeling, considering your presentation, that so many things happen, difficult, dangerous, devastating most of the times. Time flies, and I got really anxious, so give me some hope here. Are there any trends?
So on trends that are positive, well, green transition is definitely a positive trend, and there's still a good amount of global collaboration there. On trends beyond 2030, the one thing we can be sure about is actually population still out to 2050. So that's fairly clear, and we can hang our hats on that. So there's a 95% chance that by 2050 the global population is going to be 9.4 billion and 10 billion. That's against 8 billion today. But then if you go out to 2100, things become much less certain. So that same 95% degree of certainty, the 2100 range is 8.9 billion and 12.4 billion. So it's not even clear whether the population is going to be higher or lower than 2050 by 2021. What we do know, of course, is that population is going to continue to age. By 2050, it's likely that 1 in 4 Europeans, let me slow that down, 1 in 4 will be over 65. It's going to be very
That's not very hopeful.
Well,
1 in 4 over
it's hopeful for us all here because we'll all be in that category, right? So
let's move to Ikaria, the longevity island. So,
if I could just sorry,
yes.
one more on that, it stresses the importance of healthcare in this mix and the healthcare burden we're going to have.
Of course.
So today, 1 in 3 children born in Japan are going to live to 100 years old. And if you look at the medical stats on dementia and you extrapolate it, more than 90% of those 100-year-olds are going to suffer from dementia by healthcare.
Yes. Okay. So what about where is Europe standing about the limit of emissions? You talked a lot about that. It's very crucial, I understand. So what do you think?
So the European position is quite interesting. In global terms, it's not a massive emitter right now. Half the emissions globally are from Asia, and
Asia is the winner.
Yeah. Well, the fight to keep climate change in check or not is going to be won and lost in Asia. But still, in a number of ways, Europe is important in this regard. Firstly, it's been a policy leader, and it needs to continue to be a policy leader. I suspect it's going to encourage others to follow that lead. It's going to be a source of technology and technology transfer and financing to help show the way for some other parts of the world, and also through its policy, its external posture. European Union has an important role to play. So, for instance, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, trade policy generally, Europe is trying to encourage. It's actually been quite American in this sense. It's a more extraterritorial approach to trade policy and external policy to try to encourage other parts of the world to adopt an emissions trading system similar to its own.
That's not a term. That's an actual need. Don't you agree?
Yeah.
What are the countries that you would say that are the leaders, and which ones are the losers on these certain subjects?
So winners and losers in 2030,
yes.
and with particularly carbon transition is really an interesting one. So winners, I suspect the Gulf states are going to come out quite well. So these are countries that are positioned well enough to make the best of the last decade or 15 years of strong oil demand and strong oil prices. They're positioned to do so. They're ready to go right now. Mm-hmm. They will use that windfall to develop some of their alternative energy techniques, industries, also to develop AI. I think Gulf adoption of AI is going to be really strong, really ambitious. And they're looking to their human capital. So a lot of these countries that were interested in taking guest workers in for 5 years or 10 years, now they want them to settle. They're actually more interested in getting your entrepreneurial talent into their countries right now, even than finding employment for their own people. So they're definitely thinking to the future. On the loser side, I think Russia, unless there's a big change, is one. The population is going to be a lot weaker. Oil and gas is going to have less demand for it. Isolation doesn't look a great state to be in. And I think those states that have stranded oil assets, so the likes of, say, Mexico and Nigeria, which is really struggling right now to raise production, it's those countries that have relied on oil but actually cannot do what the Gulf states are going to do. They're the ones that I think will be losers in the next years.
You talked about the AI a lot. There's a major discussion nowadays about these. I would really like to ask you, what do you think about other bad scenarios about the AI, about the people that are going to lose their jobs, or all these, these bad scenarios that no one is ever going to be free and safe again, and blah, blah, blah. Is this really a slight chance that this might happen? What do the data say?
Well, the data right now is not really good enough to give any firm conclusions. Technology is moving so fast; it's difficult to see.
You can't control it.
But I hew to the view that if it looks like things are going awry, government is much more likely to step in. I think it's quite interesting.
Intervene, you mean?
Sure. To regulate. I mean, what we're definitely going to see is very different approaches in different parts of the world. So China is the one that's regulated most on AI right now. It's a very clear sense of where it sees AI fits into its economic model and governance model. which is why the Chinese equivalent of ChatGPT is not going to tell you anything about Xinjiang. They've decided to close that bit down because they're focused on business processes. In Europe, it's a more open process. In the United States, a more open process. But partly because the big tech companies are mainly in the United States, you'll probably see differences between Europe and the United States on this just increasing over time.
Thank you so much. It's been an honor.
Oh.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.